Welcome everyone to Dialogue. So with an online comedy competition garnering millions of views and becoming one of the most watched shows of its kind, stand-up comedy is thriving both online and offline here in China. So what are these new comedians expressing and why are they becoming so popular? Are we entering a golden time for China's stand-up comedy? Well, to find out more, I'll talk with two stand-up comedians who took part in the comedy competition program called Rock and Roast. They are Nora Young and Lila. We also have on the program today David Moser, who is an associate professor at Capital Normal University, and Professor Teng Jimeng, a senior research fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Michael Wong. So welcome everyone to this very interesting topic. Nora, I want to begin with you. We're having a talk show about a talk show, essentially, is what we're doing here. Let me begin with you in a very high level, very philosophical question. And that's, what's your understanding, Nora, of comedy or stand-up comedy in general?
Wow. Yeah, just give me an hour and I'll be ready to elaborate on my topic. I think stand-up is ultimately an art to make people laugh. That's it. That's my understanding of it.
Simple, quick, and I think also very insightful as well. Professor Teng, what do you think from a more theoretical perspective? How do you perceive comedy, the essence of comedy?
Well, comedy, once again, is a tragedy. Comedy is also something that makes you laugh and laugh with the kind of a bitterness and sometimes the outrageousness that you, especially when you are in that very particular kind of auditorium. So comedy is all about satirizing the very ills and perhaps the very dark side of the moon on our planet. And some comedy can also be really something really happy to make us laugh and laugh at the power, for example, the power of puns and poetry.
Yeah, I mean, we often hear of that statement in terms of comedy and tragedy. They are two sides of the same coin. Perhaps expand on that, Professor Teng, a little bit more for us in terms of what that means.
Well, absolutely. I mean, comedy can make you laugh, but then the laugh usually originates from this very everyday life. For example, right now in America, I mean, the one comedian I like most is Joe Wan, who actually kind of derived lots of his materials from his everyday life as a new generation of immigrants in the U.S. society. At the same time, he's also crossing the Pacific Ocean here in China and try to actually elaborate on and use his experience back in the United States to shed lights on our understanding of a different society, of a different culture. And so in this sense, Joe Wang proves to be an icon, a kind of like comedian philosopher that reflects upon the very dilemma, the very polite, and sometimes the very the comic things in in both of our cultures. And so, in this sense, I think comedians are philosopher performers.
Professor Moser, I want to come to you because you've learned something called xiangsheng, and this is a traditional Chinese comedic performance. What do you think are sort of the similarities and perhaps differences between traditional Chinese comedy, xiangsheng, and stand-up comedy?
Well, of course, xiangsheng still exists, and Guo Gang is probably the most famous performer. And it has its place, and it's quite a high art form. The difference is that xiangsheng is based on a traditional sort of format in which you have these scripted dialogues. So they can be very funny, and they can sometimes be very reflective of modern life sometimes. Mostly they had to do with earlier eras of Chinese history in the 20th century. Stand-up is, what's different about stand-up is it's not a scripted story or a set piece. It's more like a chance to riff or to sort of explore different sort of social problems, life problems, 谈恋爱, finding a husband or wife, and all the daily sorts of problems. And so the topic can flip from one thing to another. It's very free form, actually. And also another big difference is with Nora and Lila, they come on stage as themselves and talk about their own lives and talk about their own problems. So the comedy springs from their own lives. Of course, it's exaggerated and they're making fun of lots of things, but they come up as themselves and they speak to the audience directly on the basis of their own lives. So that's part of the excitement of the form. It's very direct and reflects modern life, modern urban life.
I mean, speaking about their own lives and then also very relatable to audiences in general. So I think that's also what makes comedy click and stick. And Lila, what do you think really makes a good stand-up comedian? I mean, you're American. It's been an interesting life journey for you. You had dreams and aspirations of Broadway, and now you're an American doing stand-up comedy here in China.
Oh, I mean, I think it's kind of difficult to answer right now because I just started a few months ago. But for me, I would say that the art of comedy, in a sense, is a learning process of what is funny and entertaining to an audience. So I think that once you have some sort of a grasp on that concept, then you can start to, head down the road of being a good comedian.
Well, it's a learning process, certainly, for sure. Nora, are you born funny? Is someone born funny and witty, or can you really go through life experiences and then become funny later on? Because I don't have any funny bones in my body. I cannot be funny no matter how hard I try. So I'm trying to get some advice here. People who perhaps they think they're not funny themselves, but they want to be funny. I mean, what's going on here?
There are definitely a group of people who are born funny. I've seen them. Those are the people that I lost to in a competition, and those are people that I hate. But jokes aside, I think there are definitely different types of comedian, and I am fortunate to be one that's born in a funny family. Like my dad is a super funny guy. He's the one that will stand out in his generation and then make every people laugh in his reunions or parties. So I'm very lucky to be influenced by him. But me myself, I'm not as funny as him, but I love or I enjoy making people around me happy.
Yeah.
I don't like the scenes where people are just quite silent, or they're just eating. They're talking. They're not making fun. They're not making everybody actually laugh or smile from the sincerity of their heart. So the very drive of my personality actually make me stick in the industry and then have been doing it so far.
Yeah. Then Nora, do you think you can learn from life experiences, that really it's about experiences in life, your perceptions of life as you mature and grow older? Can you then draw from that as well to become funnier and funnier?
I think life experience is very important because they are the source of your jokes. They're the source of your material. If you are a super young person, for example, I've seen college students, I've even seen a middle school age boy who started to do comedy, but all he can talk about is school stuff, which is funny from a sense because he's a very new perspective in terms of nowadays Chinese comedy. But when he runs out of topic, then he's out of topic. He doesn't have enough life experience to support him. He's not yet a boy who's dated a girl yet, and he's not entered the workforce yet, and he doesn't have any family burden, and all his source of comedy is school, and that's it, and maybe a part of purity things that I'm not familiar with, but that is it. So I definitely agree with the concept that when you are older or when you're more mature, when you have more life stories, then you can become a better comedian. Not to mention that you can always work on your skill set because there actually are structures to be a better comedian, writers, which you can work on. This is not something that's just random or that just genius can do.
Yeah, well, I guess the more life experiences that you have, the more relatable you can be as well and connect with more audiences. Professor Tong, but there are so many young people, I feel, that really want to break into this industry. I mean, from your perspective, how difficult is it to sort of get into the stand-up comedy industry in China? It's quite nascent still, I would say.
I mean, yes, right now what you see here in China, and especially in those clubs in Sanlitun area or in Raccoon Roast, these guys are young, and most of these people are actually returnees from the West, and so they pick it up. They pick it up in the West, and especially in English-speaking countries. And what they try to transfer back into China sometimes are actually. Not coming across, are not understood by the Chinese audience. And so in this sense, I think there should be lots of work to be done, actually localizing the Western style comedy when you try to perform that in China. And so you need to seek a common ground. You need to seek a point where you can blend the two cultures or to blend the two kind of comedies?
I mean, it's very difficult, I feel, to perhaps localize stand-up comedy if you're thinking about a confluence of East and West. I mean, Professor Moser, how difficult is this? How challenging is this? Are you seeing perhaps stand-up comedy in China, there are elements of crosstalk being infused into it, but you also have to localize it to a certain extent, maybe draw elements from Western comedy as well?
Well, I think it's kind of funny that you're questioning two really boring academics here when we have stand-up comedians on the show. But I do want to point out Nora, who I've watched online. I really like what she does actually with language. A lot of her bits have some very true to life and funny observations about this sort of blend of English and Chinese and Chinglish in the modern young people's world. I think she reflects very eloquently and hilariously the fact that the direct translations happen, that you can sort of be thinking in English and throwing in English words all over the place. She does that very well, and I think she succeeds at it, sort of capturing this international feel of what it's like to be in urban China and to be a young person. The East and West are just fused together, and they mix in sometimes very hilarious ways. And language, the way that English creeps into things is a big part of that. And I think what Nora does, to me, as someone who loves language and is a linguist and who loves xiangsheng because of that, I really love what she's doing with language and highlighting that. It's really fantastic. For people who haven't seen her, get on and especially if you speak English. She does English, she does English stand-up as well. She's very good at both, and she does them, differently in both. That's a challenge. I mean, she has to be funny in the Chinese context while being clean, whereas usually in the English context, stand-up comedy tends to be a little bit more foul-mouthed, a little bit, but that's just a difference in style. Yeah. But I say, keep going, Nora, because you're doing really great stuff. I think it's really, really wonderful.
Nora, I mean, that's a pretty strong endorsement from Professor Moser. Would you like to respond?
Wow, I am so flattered. I mean, I'm definitely gonna write a joke about you, Professor Moser. Just make sure that you are in my bed, and you were gonna love it.
That's the greatest compliment Nora can give to you, Professor Moser. She's gonna write a line about you.
Well, my wife thinks I am a joke, but anyway, go ahead.
Oh, that's funny too. I'll take that. I'll take that one. Lila, what about you? I mean, did you have some trouble adjusting to localizing your jokes and your lines for the Chinese market, or what do you think is really funny and stand out for an audience here in China?
I actually didn't have that issue because I've never performed stand-up in English, actually. I just kind of went straight to learning it in Chinese. And so when it comes to the audience, it's like what I was saying before, that comedy is a learning process about what is funny to an audience. And it's not the audience, it's an audience. Which audience are you performing to? So if you're performing to an audience here, then you naturally need to have some sort of an understanding of what is funny here, and whether here means China or a specific city like Shanghai or Shenzhen. It's also very different. And that's the same thing in any country, is when you're in a different city, you sometimes want to have jokes that are local to the city or poke fun at another city that has a rivalry with a different city. So it's all just about getting to know your audience. So I think that's something that I've been working on as a beginner.
And Nora, what do you think are the biggest challenges, I think, for you on stage and off stage when it comes to a stand-up comedian here in China?
I think the biggest challenge is always to have new material, and that's number one, because I perform quite often, but I perform mostly in Shanghai due to the pandemic. So a lot of audience, they were so eager to see comedy. They will even come to comedy 3 times a week, which is too much. They would just, I remember when I started to do comedy, maybe 2 years into the industry, there was an audience, and after I got off stage, he pat on my shoulder and he's like, "Hey, I've seen the same bit last night. You should really work on your new material." I'm like, "What? Can you just not come that often?" And he's like, "I'm on a business trip to Shanghai. I make sure that I get the most out of the trip. So I booked all the tickets that I can. during the past week. I'm
But
like,
how
oh my God,
difficult?
you're my
How
worst
difficult
type
is
of
it to get
audience.
new material? I mean, I think you have to really rack your brain around this, the new content once in a
Yeah.
while.
It's not that easy at all. Not to mention he came to the showcases, which are what we call the formal showcases, where we will perform on mature materials only, not the ones that we're working on.
Okay.
So if it's open-minded, I can try to make new stuff every single day, but I can't guarantee they're all funny. But if it's a formal showcase, I cannot just guarantee I can work on a new great like 5 minute material every single month even, because that takes also inspiration, like genius and hard work and all the things that you can imagine. So I think always coming up with new stuff is definitely one of the biggest challenge. And then the second challenge is once you're able to perform in different cities, as Lila mentioned, or countries, how to accommodate the local audience is definitely going to be a big change. I try to do like headlines in China where I realized the jokes works in the south part, doesn't really work on the northern part, for example. And also when I go to US and perform, I remember I took part in San Francisco comedy competition, and what they do, funnily, is that they were organized 4 different types of showcases, and then you have to compete in each scenario. For example, there's a wine house where there's a group of like people who are elder audience, and there's a bookstore with a bunch of college students. There's a restaurant by the beach side where there's a room of very lousy audience who are kind of tipsy and drunk as well. And there's another place, a theater audience, who are more elegant but more composed, but they will respond strong if it's a very smart joke. So in order to be the winner of the competition, you have to, although they're all California people, but you have to customize your joke to suit the audience that night in that specific scenario, which I find it to be a super challenging thing to do, but also a very astonishing thing to do when you can make it.
Yeah, absolutely. And what about the mindset if you do bomb the stage, guys? Lila, let me ask you this question. What is your mindset when you bomb a performance and maybe comedians that start out, they'll have to go through some of these experiences, but how do you deal with such an experience?
I mean, like when you're still on stage, just, try to laugh at yourself. Try to kind of take note of what's happening, like admit, okay, I'm not doing so well. And then once you're off the stage, you can cry.
Got it. That helps to release the emotions a little bit. Nora, what about you? I'm not saying you guys have bombed any performance, but I'm just saying for any aspiring stand-up comedians, the mindset that they should have, perhaps.
The mind is always that no matter how famous, how successful, or how great you think you are going to bomb on stage.
Okay.
It just, whether yesterday or today or tomorrow, it's going to happen.
It's good.
So
It's good to have
very
that mindset
of, you're doomed to bomb. So just don't take it as a surprise. It's going to happen.
Okay. I want to bring it back to a more high-level question and maybe talk about the trend of stand-up comedy in China overall. I want to get, an academic perspective on this, and from Nora and Lila as well, in terms of why are we seeing such a monumental rise, quite a speedy rise of stand-up comedy here in China, Professor Tang? I mean, what does that reflect about Chinese society?
On this very age, right now, what I see is a kind of emancipated confidence on the part of these young ladies, these young women in China who are quite capable of fighting on and fighting a different battle from their parental generation. I mean, I appreciated Yang Li at one point when he challenged these very residues of the patriarchal elements in Chinese society, especially in love relationship, in marriage, and especially in Liai period. And so her very famous satire is about his young male counterpart. Why are you so confident, even if you are not so good, if you are not as good as me? I mean, so in a sense, this is very interesting confidence that this young generation are experiencing.
Yeah, and we are seeing more and more female stand-up comedians as well. That's, I feel, also a trend. Professor Moser, you seem to be steeped in thought there as well. What are your perspectives in terms of why we are seeing this rise, this quite rapid rise of stand-up comedy in China?
Well, a lot of it has to do with the rise of the internet and social media. being here for the last 30 years, I've seen Chinese state media go from a very much of a top-down sort of a media with galas and things with huge audiences, but very much something that didn't have much interactive quality to it. These things were put on and the audience just passively watched them. Stand-up comedy and these shows are quite different because, first of all, they're very topical. They don't just reflect this year, they reflect like the events of the last week. And so right now, Chinese life in many ways is much more complicated and complex than it used to be, especially urban life, the big cities. There's lots of frustrations, there's all sorts of daily problems, things that used to be taken care of are now things you have to solve on your own. So in a certain way, young people especially, I think they crave and they need this sort of a direct kind of a dialogue, or at least a person on stage who's reflecting the same kinds of frustrations and feelings that they feel in everyday life. It's very important that the audience have, this sort of, I don't know how you say, a 共鸣, a sort of a resonance with the comedian on the stage. And because it's so direct and immediate and colloquial and also emotional, the people are complaining, they're, lamenting, and it's a perfect sort of, a sort of cathartic experience from the audience, which is what stand-up comedy should be. I was raised watching stand-up comedy on US TV, and the most successful comedians were always the ones who sort of tapped into a kind of pain, as Professor Tung was saying, frustration and pain and aggravation and the problems of daily life. And I think now China, because it's so diversified, and frankly, you have lots of young people like Lila and Nora who have very been influenced, who have seen Western stand-up and they know what its purpose is and how it works, and they're able to do it in Chinese in a very effective way. And there's all the venues and the interest and the ratings over the roof. So it's at the right time with the right people and the right young group of people who are very keyed into international and local Chinese issues. So it's a win-win situation.
Yeah. Nora, I mean, would you echo what Professor Tung and what Professor Moser has just said in terms of how you see the rise of stand-up comedy in China?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with the rising of, especially the rising focus of Chinese comedians, actually a rising focus of the young women generation. And also, I definitely agree with that. Resonation is the key point why so many young people love stand-up. And then on top of that, I also wanted to add that I think now Chinese people, we lack physical entertainment stuff to do. Like there are a lot of virtual entertainment we can get through all the, short video platform. But then in order to physically go out and meet friends, there's always just like getting meals together, going karaoke or going lockdown, and that's it. So stand-up comedy is a new form of physical scenario for people to get together and then to spend time together physically, which is something that people want and they need more. And that's why I think stand-up also rise quickly because of that.
Yeah. And Lila, one of China's leading stand-up comedians, and I think you know him well as well, is the producer of the Chinese stand-up comedy competition I mentioned earlier called Rock and Roast. So the guy's name is called Li Dan, and he said, this is his very famous phrase, everyone could be a 5-minute stand-up comedian. I mean, do you agree with that? What changes after those 5 minutes then?
Yeah, I do agree with it. I think that you could understand it on two different levels. One is that it's something that anyone can try out. Like you don't need a certificate, you don't need any like fancy equipment. Like you can just try it. You can try to write something and say it. Like whether or not it's amazing doesn't really matter. It's just kind of putting yourself out there. So it's something anyone can try. And then on the second level is that it's not necessarily that every single person, it's every type of person. Like on the most recent season, we had like a police officer come, we had someone who researches like cancer in children. Like we had a lot of people who like we didn't traditionally see on the stage and like wouldn't necessarily think that, oh, like maybe they're like a stand-up comedian. But, they really showed us that any kind of person, like even, a professor, like you guys could try it out. Anyone can be a 5-minute comedian.
Right. So Professor Tung, Professor Moser, perhaps as a side gig, you guys can also try some stand-up comedy here in China. But Professor Tung, you talk about the art of offense. I want to ask Nora. I mean, how do you think about that fine line between perhaps what is funny and perhaps what could come off as perhaps insensitive or insulting? Where are the boundaries in your mind?
I think the line is always very flexible. It really depends on the audience as well as the comedian's comfort zone with the audience. For example, I think the Chinese audience, they are now being educated what stand-up is. So they don't actually, not all of them know what it is. They're still kind of confusing it with 相声, confusing it with a 脱口秀 or talk show, or confusing it with a very funny speech. Like I have a colleague who think my boss speech with a few funny points is called stand-up comedy. I was like, that's not. That's a meeting. That we have a funny boss and that's it. It's not comedy. So while we are still kind of educating the audience, we're kind of exploring the line or expanding the line. I think for the cities where we have more comedy like clubs to go, then the audience will have a higher tolerance of what's offensive and what's just funny. But with those which they don't have any comedy clubs at all, or the audience, they only see comedy from online shows, or they only see it from even less source of that, and they will think anything that's new or that's sharp as offensive. So it's really a fine line to draw.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're a bit short on time, guys, so I want to get your take on the final word, final advice, suggestions, or opinion, whatever you have for aspiring stand-up comedians who really want to make it big here in this industry, which is really difficult, I think, to become a really prominent stand-up comedian. So, Nora, let me start with you. What are your final words for aspiring stand-up comedians?
Just two things. Write your own bit, stick to it, and then you are going to love it.
Write your own bit and stick to it. Great. Lila, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, just be original, be yourself. As long as you're yourself, like there will be an audience that really likes you for you. And I think also that if you're interested in stand-up comedy, your goal doesn't have to be like, a superstar, like a comedy superstar. Like you can be very successful, like offline as well. So, don't be like discouraged if you are super into stand-up, but you can't be like number one.
So keep at it. Experience definitely helps in getting there. Professor Moser, I guess from your perspective, this is from an audience perspective. What about you? Final words for aspiring stand-up comedians.
Well, I would say, originality is very important. I think they have to be in touch with as much with daily life as you possibly can. Success can kind of preempt that. The more successful you get, the less you sort of feel what it likes to live in daily life. So I was don't lose that don't get out of touch with your friends, with ordinary life. Maybe you can afford to take a taxi cab, but try taking the subway every now and then so that you understand what it's like to take the subway, or even try walking. And then you have your comedy will be more resonant with the ordinary people in their lives.
Yeah, great advice. And then Professor Tung, the final word and the last word.
Okay, I mean, ride on the subway. I mean, not too much taxi. Get into touch with the people, with your own generation, and just try to stay afloat with the people around you.
Great. Great advice from all of you. And of course, laughter, the best antidote for so many things in life. And it's great to see the rise of stand-up comedy and comedy overall here in China. Fascinating discussion. Thank you to all of you. Nora, Lila, you can catch them on Rock and Roast. They're fantastic comedians. Check out their bits. And then Professor Moser, Professor Tung, thank you so much for your perspectives on this as well. And that's going to wrap up this edition of Dialogue here on CGTN. I'm Michael Wong here in Beijing. We'll see you again next time.